How are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? I'm Dr. Shelby Harris, Director of Sleep Health at Sleepopolis, and this is Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby. Today, we're talking to Sleepopolis Head of Content, Molly Stout, about late night binge watching. But first, is your sleep worse if you sleep with a pet? Last spring, a study was published in Scientific Reports that found that more than half of surveyed pet owners were woken up nightly by their pets due to noise, movement, or even excessive heat. The study also found that dogs were more likely, sorry dog owners, to disrupt their co-sleeper than cats, despite the psychological comfort a dog might actually provide. In some surveys, the study found that co-sleeping pet owners took longer to fall asleep and were more likely to feel tired upon awakening. But by and large, the results were mixed, with some pet co-sleepers reporting no sleep loss at all. So it goes without saying, you should make your own call when it comes to your own sleeping arrangement. But personally, I say keep the dogs and cats outside of the bedroom, but that's mostly because I'm a pretty light sleeper. So one less distraction for your end of day routine. But there's research now, believe it or not, that actually suggests that some people actually benefit from having a pet in their room. So it's kind of mixed. So as I often say, you do you. If you have a dog that's snoring really loud, that's causing you to wake up, the snoring dog is this thing that I hear all the time, then you really need to think about whether that's helping you or not. Where do you weigh on that, Molly? Do you have any pets?
I don't currently, but I remember when I was younger, I had this big yellow lab, and he would always curl up in bed with me. And I was probably, 6, 7, 8, something like that. And I found it very comforting. But more importantly, I've had cats over the years, and they are obsessed with crawling under the covers and like burrowing in when
Yeah.
you're in the bed. So medically, scientifically, what's the deal with that?
I don't know. The cat's coming in embarrassed. I mean, I've never had cats. People, please don't come
Oh,
at me
gotcha.
for never having cats. I'm a dog person. I don't have a dog now, but I grew up with dogs. And it's interesting. Like, I think about it. My parents have had their dogs for years just sleep on like a little bed in their room next to their bed, and the dog doesn't come in. And their dogs have never disrupted their sleep. But once the animals start getting into the bed, that can sometimes be a problem for some people. And I hear that
Definitely.
cats do that a lot too. Ever stream something before bed, listeners? Ever fall asleep still listening to your speakers or headphones? Have you ever put on something new and just lost track of time? If so, it's possible you've been binge watching. I've been there many times. And you're not alone. According to recent surveys, an estimated 70 to 90% of Americans routinely binge watch. 70 to 90%. That's like mind-boggling. The advent of streaming and the ability to consume countless hours of nearly everything and anything is still relatively new, and the associated health concerns are still being studied. So, how does binging like this really impact our sleep? Is it that much worse to binge in bed? And what about the kind of content that we binge? Is it possible for maybe a true crime podcast? Maybe could that have any impact on your day-to-day functioning than, say, a health and wellness podcast, or like I like to listen to, baking and comedy podcast, or even listening to something like Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby? So that's what our head of content, Molly Stout, has been wondering the last couple of years, since she's, quote, literally been putting herself to sleep with murder podcasts for the last decade. A self-described true crime obsessive by day, Molly oversees the creation of articles, posts, videos, and podcasts for Sleepopolis and Pillar 4 Media. Molly, we're really excited for you to join us. So welcome to Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby.
Thank you so much. I've been listening to every episode, so I'm excited to finally be part of one.
Thank you. And thanks for everything you do. I'm glad to have you here. So now, Molly, I know you're no stranger to sleep talking, but just so the audience knows, on top of all the amazing editorial work that you do with Sleepopolis, you also work with our show team producing this podcast. I'm curious, before we get into any nighttime habits, could you describe your day-to-day a little bit? So when does your day start? For instance, like what's your usual routine look like?
So I am lucky enough to have a 6-year-old daughter, which is a wonderful alarm clock.
Mm-hmm.
Highly recommend. But I wake up around 6 or 6:30, which is when she wakes up. She gets into bed with me. It's actually very pleasant. But I am one of those people who needs to go straight from the bed to the coffee machine, get my coffee, then I
Yeah.
can sort of relax a little bit. So, all day I'm working for Sleepopolis, of course, producing some of our news and health content. And then it's back to parenting when it's pickup time, end of work. A lot of people call that the second shift for
Yeah.
parents. And so that really gets squared away by, I'd say, 8:15 p.m. at the latest. And again, I don't think I'm alone. For parents out there, it sort of feels like that's the first time of the day that you sort of get to
Yeah.
be quote unquote by yourself or relax a little bit. And for whatever reason, and I'm sure I can ask my therapist why, but I'm soothed by somewhat tense, thrilling, like dramatic, somewhat scary content, actually. Part of it is on screen. I'm currently rewatching Game of Thrones, which is not light fare. It's
Mm-hmm.
lots of violence, lots of mystery, lots of murder, true crime, not true crime, but crime. And for the last 10 years, as you said, I've really gotten hooked on narrative podcasts. My favorites do have to do with murder, true crime, the mysteries of solving them.
Hmm.
It all started with Serial 10 years ago, which I'm sure a lot
Yep.
of people remember.
I listened
It
to
was a
that. Yep.
Did you?
Yep.
Yes. So it's funny because I just remember hearing a ton of people talking about it. And I
Yeah.
was like, at first I thought they were talking about cereal, as in the breakfast cereal. And then finally I figured it out and I started listening to it before bed and I could not stop listening to it. And it took me, a few weeks, but I finally figured out how to, you know, set an alarm to the podcast so that you don't wind up like listening all night long, so that you can actually pause as you're falling asleep. But long story short, it started with Serial. I knew I wasn't alone when another podcast called My Favorite Murder launched. I don't know if you've heard of this one, but it's a bunch of
No,
you said you like comedy,
I like comedy. I
not comedy
wait.
about murder.
No. I
Got
can't even,
it.
we'll get into, I can't even handle Law and Order watching it. I
Oh
know when you
no.
hear it, like the first 2 minutes, there's going to be a
Yes.
murder in the beginning. I know it's happening. I still can't watch it. So
It's
Serial is
always
about
a
as much as
murder.
I've gone. Yep.
Yes, there's something called My Favorite Murder, and it's these two ladies. They are very funny about it. So they approach it from a comedic tilt, but it is about murders, famous ones. So I knew I wasn't alone. And, some of the top podcasts, even if you look at them now, like the top 50, top five, even, they are sort of revolving around true crime. And so, focused on lore. Then there's a lot
Yeah.
about mysteries that aren't just murder related. For example, now I'm listening to one called Hysterical, and it's about a mystery not having to do with murder, but it's about like a mysterious medical situation that was happening upstate in New York. But I've often said there's one podcast, the last one I'll mention here, but it's called Case File and it's Australian. And he's quite literally just a man, an anonymous man, describing from start to finish a story of a true crime that happened in Australia. Like no guests, no interruptions, nothing. Just this one little man with a wonderful Australian accent describing a crime. And I
Huh.
call that my melatonin. I mean, if I put that on, I'm easily put to sleep. And it's odd, I know. And I've always wondered, I know I'm not alone in this,
No.
but if I'm listening to dark stuff when I'm falling asleep, um, I do wonder, like, what is that doing to me overnight? What is it doing to potentially my dreams? And also, does it affect in any way your mood during the day after
Mm-hmm.
listening to all this stuff?
Well, do you think that there's any impact?
I haven't noticed any.
Yeah.
My mood is pretty good during the day, even after I listen to this great, scary stuff.
I'm one of those people, and I hope that listeners have figured this out by now when it comes to sleep, that I'm not a one size fits all person. There's certain things like drinking a 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke before bed might not be ideal. But for most people, like we got to see what works for you. And take me through, like, if it doesn't seem to impact your sleep, like how does this work? Like, do you get in bed and put it on? I'm so curious about this timer thing because I actually know nothing about this. So teach us.
Yes. So, it really is me getting into bed. This is
Okay.
after I've done my nighttime routine. This is after my daughter's in bed. This is after I've relaxed with my partner. This is
Like
after,
9-ish?
I'm a little later bedtime than
It's so
that.
early.
But no, I would say it's around 10:30.
Okay.
So this is pajamas on, teeth brushed, face washed, like all
Okay.
the proper things that you do, getting under the covers finally. I am a reader before bed, and I do unfortunately do it on my screen, but
Okay.
moving on.
And we can talk
I
about that too
always
in a minute. Yeah.
Yes, we will. Yeah, we have to. But I don't want to fall asleep with a screen in my face, so I
Okay.
put all that away. And instead of something like a noise machine or sound machine, I put in my AirPods and I'll turn to, whatever the latest chapter is in a certain mystery that I'm listening to. It could
Mhm.
be just a standalone episode, it could be part of a series that I'm catching up on over the week. But either way, I put it on and it can be super dark. Like, doesn't matter how dark. There's a podcast called Sword and Scale. If you've heard of it, you know what I'm talking about. Don't listen to it if you haven't heard of it. Warning. But I do notice, my body relaxes. I get really drawn into the story.
Mhm.
Eventually, my mind just sort of relaxes, and I'm out within less than 30 minutes, I should say. But the interesting thing that you can do, and again, it took me a while to discover this,
Yeah.
was you can have a timer on your podcast, whatever, if it's Apple, if it's Spotify, whatever it is. There's an option. You can do, stop playing when the episode ends, and that can range from however long they are, hour and a half.
Mhm.
Or you can do, stop playing after 30 minutes, something like that. I know a friend who does that. But so, yeah, you have a lot of options. And I almost wonder, a lot of the time, I wonder if that tool was like created for people like me who are listening to podcasts to fall asleep.
Probably. Probably.
Yes.
I
So,
It's so interesting. I mean, I feel like you're saying that you don't notice it impacting the quality of your sleep. You don't have
correct.
routinely vivid dreams or nightmares about these things. You
Hmm.
feel fine. You need your coffee in the morning. I mean, I do
Hmm.
too, but you feel fine during the day. So I
I
wonder if
do.
maybe there's something to be said about listening to something that's, I don't want to say technical, but it's got like,
Hmm.
there's stuff to focus on, right? But I wonder
Yes.
if that, in a way, for you, is a way to quiet your brain, right?
I wonder about that too, because there the other options, and there are plenty out there. There are meditation
Yeah.
podcasts you can listen to fall asleep. There are literally, bedtime stories that are
Yep.
popular that people can listen to, and that comforts them and that sort of relaxes them and relaxes their mind. Is there, and maybe this is an open question we can't answer necessarily, but is there something about certain people, certain personalities where the relaxation comes in from hearing a story that could turn in any direction that might be somewhat dangerous.
Mhm.
I also wonder if it's related to the fact that I love horror movies, not to fall asleep to necessarily, but a lot of my friends do not want to watch any horror. I know a lot of people who are like, nope, I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear about it. There's no way I'm going to buy a ticket to a
Yep.
movie if it involves anything scary. And I'm drawn to that. I find it really thrilling. I find it like it gets feeling out of you, whether that's excitement or fright or anything like that. But I do wonder, there for someone who's not like me, who just enjoys this kind of scary or dark content, Game of Thrones is included in there,
Yeah.
It's not always murder. It can be fantasy, it can be fiction. But I do wonder, if you need to turn that off before bed. You're binging a crazy, scary show,
Right.
and then you're not going to fall asleep to that. But is there some kind of technique between turning off the show, turning off the podcast, and then getting into bed? Is there something people need to do to sort of go from one stage to another?
There's not one size fits all, unfortunately, like
Mhm.
I was saying earlier. So it's a bit of trial and error for some people.
Yeah.
So like you were talking about the horror movies. Like I just this past weekend had dinner with three girlfriends who absolutely love murder horror podcasts. They
Yeah.
see horror movies in October and call the entire month Shocktober.
Oh, I want to meet
I
these
know, isn't that
friends.
just, I take no part. I've known them for years. I take no part in this stuff. So
Yep.
they can watch that stuff at night and listen to it and be fine going to bed. I could never, I mean, even if I listened to something like that during the day, it would still like freak me out for hours. So it's a little
Wow.
bit of trial and error, right? So even for me, if I watch like a really heavy drama that just really was gripping, I can't do that right before bed. I need to have a good 2 hour buffer. And then what do?
Yep.
I might read, I might watch or listen to something that's lighter that I could kind of go in and out of.
Mhm.
I have to have at least a 2 hour buffer between something that's really
Yes.
heavy. So, like right now, the Olympics are going on, and I'm watching
Mhm.
it way too late. And I love the track and field and the marathon coming up
Oh,
and all this
yeah.
stuff. And I get so sucked into it that I actually, even with something like that, I have trouble quieting my brain down. So it is trial and error, and
Yes.
there's no one thing that works. It might just be putting on something else that is relaxing that doesn't take up so much mental space. It might just be taking all media all together and putting that away and doing something like I mean, it could be reading, but sometimes that's even stimulating for some people, right? So it's
Yes.
finding what works for you and then
Yep.
figuring out the amount of time that you need for certain things. And then also
You know,
knowing that once in a while, you're not going to be perfect with it. You might get stuck up really late, staying up really late watching the Olympics or whatever.
it
But
is funny that you mentioned like the falling asleep to reading as well, which is
yep,
something I do try to do. I've had a few nights, more than a few here and there over the past 10 years of being a true crime obsessive, where I don't actually have access to a podcast or
yeah,
like I'm on vacation, I forgot something.
yeah,
And I find it difficult to go to sleep without any stimulation,
yep,
whether it's a screen or something audio, whatever it is. Some people, maybe if they're on vacation, they don't have their favorite sound machine,
yep,
and you find yourself just like all of a sudden everything is still and dark and quiet, and it's a little bit unsettling.
yep.
Whereas a lot of people need that to fall asleep. So it's interesting what people's sort of crutches are and how much they're dependent on it sometimes.
You hit on the word perfectly, which I use all the time, is a sleep crutch. So
Yeah.
people often ask me, like, what do you think of white noise machines? What do you think of weighted blankets, podcasts, or even like you were saying, like the meditations, the sleep meditations or the bedtime stories? If it works for you and you have no problem with it and it's great, then go ahead and use it. That's fine. But you have to be prepared for that night when maybe your phone isn't working. You can't get that podcast. Or are you going to be willing to bring a 15-pound weighted blanket with you everywhere you go to be able to sleep, right? So it's those sorts of things that you need to think about. The white noise, you get very
Mhm.
attached to it. And for people who are trying to get off of using something like a podcast, or they really just don't want to do it because they don't like how attached they are to it, or even like the meditations, I usually I encourage people to like kind of slowly taper down on it. So like you were doing with the timer, to make the
Yep.
timing less over time. Or I've had patients that will have the TV on, and we'll talk about
Hmm.
that for sure. They'll have the TV, or now it's more like a phone or an iPad in their face. And instead, I'll say, okay, let's move from that. Let's turn the brightness down on it, or let's move to like a radio that's going to play. So you're taking some of the kind of the stimulation from
Yep.
visual and noise, and you're now starting to reduce it a bit. So then it can be a radio, and you'll have something talking, or a podcast, and then from there maybe move it to white noise, and then just slowly turn the volume down on the white noise. So you can slowly get yourself off of those kind of crutches. But
Yeah.
if you don't mind the times when you can't have it with you, then you're okay with it. Like it doesn't usually impact someone's sleep unless when it does, people know. They definitely know.
And yeah, and you're talking a lot about, screens, which, we read a lot of stories all the time about how terrible
Mhm.
screen time is, especially for kids. But looking at Gen Z, for example, I mean, they're more likely to be binging a great show
Yeah.
on their iPad or laptop or whatever it is. And a lot of the time, they're doing it in bed. They're
Yep.
doing it through the, like, from day to night. That's sort of
Yep.
their evening routine, is to binge a show. So they're in bed. The lights are basically going down. There's no more sun. They're all set up like for falling asleep. And yet they have this blue light, this big screen in their face.
Yeah.
And, if that's happening so often, is there, are there any sort of dangers to that behavior. Because as adults, I mean, I'm an adult, I'm not certainly not Gen Z, but I'm pretty addicted to my iPad at
Mhm.
night, whether it's for reading or anything like that. And we read so many horror stories like, don't do this, put your tech away. But it's just a habit of so many generations of people.
Yeah.
So I do wonder, is it worth, trying to wean off of it if nothing negative in your life is going on? Like if nothing seems to be impacting you, if you're able to fall asleep, is it really that bad?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, my colleague, Dr. Gradazar, has really made it a mission, I think, over the past year or so to really try and dig deep into the data about how
Right.
bad blue light is.
Hmm.
And he's been saying something that he's kind of hitting the nail on the head a bit more. And that the initial study that was done, I want to say 10 to 15 years ago at Harvard, if I remember correctly, that study that looked at blue light and the impact on trouble falling asleep, it delayed sleep by 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh,
I know it's shocking, right? Given how
a little
much
bit, yeah.
society has taken the limit blue light an hour to 2 hours
Yes.
before bed rule, and people have all these fancy tech and glasses and all this stuff to block the blue
Yeah,
light.
blue light blockers, all these
Ah,
kinds of gadgets you can attach. Yep.
exactly. 10 minutes. And so it's not the blue light is not the best thing, but it's also not the worst thing for sleep.
Right.
So the way that I actually try to think about it a bit is that if you're someone I'd love people to not have to rely on having a screen in front of their face just
Right.
because what happens if it's not working, that sort of stuff. But if it's working for you and it doesn't seem to create any sort of an issue and you're sleeping fine, and you're able the key is you're able to set a boundary for when to
Hmm.
go to sleep. So you say,
Yes.
okay, I'm going to watch this, and then I'm going to have this limit of, okay, 9 p.m. is my bedtime, 10 p.m., whatever. um then you're fine,
Yeah.
right? I prefer people to try to find other things, but the Gen Z stuff, I cannot tell you how many people I have worked with and talked with over the years that are love to watch either the Friends or The Office before bed. Just
Yeah.
those two shows. It's fascinating. So those two shows, those are pretty lighthearted shows to be watching before bed. If you want to watch Game of Thrones and it's not doing anything, go ahead. I don't
Yeah.
mind that. But then it becomes a discussion of it's not about, okay, screens are fine. That's not it. It's about who are screens okay and not okay
Yes.
for. And that's when we're talking about binge watching, right? So
Hmm.
binge watching is a real issue in our society. People will use screens like we talked about, that revenge bedtime sort of stuff. The only time that they're
Yes.
having before going to sleep at night is this, I need to steal back some time for myself because
Yes, it
busy
becomes like a
parent, busy
selfish
job.
act.
It
Yeah.
feels very selfish. I am
Yep.
not against people finding time to do that. I do that myself. But when it
Hmm.
starts to routinely cut into your ability to turn it off and go to sleep,
Yep.
or it's impacting your ability to turn your brain off because then you're thinking about what you're watching or you're stimulated, that's when we really have to be thoughtful about who the screens are good and not good for. So, again,
Yeah.
one size does not fit all here.
It's funny too, you mentioned that because there are, a few occasions, and I'm just a binge watcher, a binge podcaster,
Yeah.
all of it. I do tend to fall asleep while I'm watching, while I'm listening. But there have been a few nights in particular that stick out in my memory, and they were when I could not fall asleep
Yeah.
despite, my normal behavior. And I've noticed, if I'm extremely stressed or,
Hmm.
something tense is happening in my work life, personal life, whatever it is, that crutch of the binge watching or the binge listening doesn't turn out well. And what I mean by that is, if I remember going through something family related,
Okay.
something we all have. And I was binge watching Breaking Bad at the time.
Hmm.
And I watched, it must have been like 10 episodes overnight. Like I just never fell asleep. And I was watching this pretty dark material. You know what it's about.
Hmm.
Um, and normally, like if everything in my life were sort of going the way I like it to go, if life were stress free, I don't think it would have been an issue. But that particular night, and I've had a few like that, where
Yeah.
even listening to one of my mystery podcasts, I'll listen. There was a night where I stayed up all night, or maybe till 4 or 5 in the morning, just listening to episode after
Yeah.
episode. And normally I'd be able to fall asleep, but I was having some kind of professional drama, you know?
Yeah.
So I do wonder, like, if you have some sort of disturbance in your life, like that has nothing to do with sleep, has nothing to do with your binging habits, you can see, or I've seen, I should say, that it'll disrupt my sleep no matter what, like no matter what my crutches are, no matter what
Hmm.
my best comforts are. Um, so they only go so far is something I would say.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said for watching those things to
Mhm.
just distract from having to think about the other stuff.
Yes, that's such a
Right?
good point.
Like, and but
Yes.
not to say that you needed a huge distraction. I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
personally what was going on, but at those times, but there are people routinely who have, for example, depression. Patients I work
Yep.
with all the time, and they'll just watch stuff
Mhm.
very late, delay going to bed,
Mhm.
either because they can't fall asleep because whatever is happening in their brain is making it hard for them to turn it off. So this is a way to distract. Or some
Yes.
people will say, like, the minute I turn that stuff off, then all the stuff is going to come back to me. And I'm going to start thinking about all the
Mhm.
stressors or whatever it is that's going on my brain at night. So then you get caught up in it, right? Very easily,
Mhm.
which is a big problem. I will say the Breaking Bad, my husband doesn't like me to share this so much, but I remember years and years ago when it first came out, he was up, not trying to avoid anything, but he got sucked into that show. And I remember like coming out at 3
Yes.
in the morning and finding him watching it late at night. I cannot handle that stuff. I will never watch
It all
that show.
started with Netflix because
Yep.
Netflix made it so easy to just jump to the next episode, and when
Yep.
Breaking Bad came there, it was all bets were off.
Yep. So, quick tip, people who are listening, if you want, and I highly encourage it, I do it myself, is a Netflix and a lot of the streaming services, you can turn off autoplay. So turn it
Yes.
off so that at the end of every episode, you might get annoyed, but you have to make an actual decision. Am I going to now lose sleep over playing another episode? So
Absolutely,
autoplay.
and that's the same tool with the podcast. You can set a little timer to make sure you don't just automatically play into the next episode or the next show.
You get sucked in very easily, right? I'll watch
Yes.
Bridgerton, Great British Bake Off, all that sort of stuff, no problem. And I could easily watch episode. I watch such fluff. It could be episode after episode for hours on end. So yeah,
Yes.
there are tools out there to really help. And if you're someone who is using your phone a lot and you're like not even just binge watching shows, right? It's just the excessive scrolling, right?
Yep.
Instagram, TikTok, all that sort of
Addicted to
stuff,
scrolling, addicted to
right?
social, all of it plays in.
Oh, so common. Then it's like there are actual apps that will turn your phone off.
Mhm.
So you can set things on even the Wi-Fi to turn it
Mhm.
off at a certain time, or your phone can actually automatically shut off. So there are things that are go-arounds. We just have to be willing to really set those limits for ourselves.
No matter how sort of dark or true crimey or scary the stuff that soothes you might be, as long as it's not actually disrupting sleep or
Yeah.
keeping you up or turning into something that's more of an addiction, then, whatever works, works.
Exactly. So, like, for example, I have some patients who have insomnia. And one of the treatments for insomnia, which goes against common sense completely, is something called sleep restriction. So, we actually have
Mhm.
patients who are not sleeping well. We have them limit their sleep to fewer hours at night. So, I'm having these patients stay up a lot later, sometimes hours later.
Wow.
And last week alone, I had one patient who said to me, I said, like, how are you going to stay up later? And she said, I don't know. I struggle with falling asleep. It's the middle of the night. That's the issue for her. And she said, you
Yeah.
know what? I'm just going to watch crime procedurals,
Yeah.
right? And police procedural dramas at night. And she watches that sort of stuff to help keep her awake to then keep
Huh.
up to a certain time to then go to sleep. And it still doesn't impact the falling asleep, but now she stays asleep a little more because she's staying up a bit later. So we can
Wow.
use these things actually therapeutically as well to
Yes.
keep
And
people,
it's
because,
so
yeah,
it's just so interesting that one person would be kept up by something like a crime procedural, whereas other people find, like myself, we
yeah,
find that relaxing, actually.
yeah, you do you, as I love to say.
You do you.
You do you. I always like if it's working and it doesn't create like almost like an addiction where it's stalling sleep
Yeah.
or making it hard to fall asleep, and you're not like, oh my gosh, if I don't have it on me in the future,
Mhm.
then it's fine. I
And
don't
also,
really have an issue.
that you make sure you're not using it as a crutch, not for sleep, but for any kind of mental health issue that might be going on. Like you said, with
Yes.
depression, it's very easy to fall into distractions by
Yeah.
TV and sort of focusing all your time on fictional lore, going on the internet and like finding a ton of other people who are discussing the same Game of Thrones episode. That can all be, relieving or distracting from
Yeah.
your real life, quote
Yeah.
unquote. But if that's what you're doing sort of day and night, and then when it all goes away, all the screens are shut down and you're find yourself alone with your thoughts and they're not tolerable, that might be more of a mental health thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hmm.
And I think the other thing to consider too is I was talking about screens, thinking about who's really appropriate for
Yes.
watching something before bed or not. The other thing to
Hmm.
consider too are like kids and teenagers, especially teenagers. Like I have a 14-year-old. He does not have his phone in his room after a certain time. It's
How
like,
did you
that's it.
do that?
I'm very strict with it.
Got
And
it.
we also have we've had apps on there over the years that will turn the phone off at a certain
Yep.
point, but we actually charge. I'm okay with it. We charge the phones in my room. So he comes in very
Hmm.
quietly, puts his phone on the charger, and I know I can see what time it was turned off and all that sort of stuff. And because the reality is teens and kids, but teens, they don't have their prefrontal cortex is not fully formed. And that's the part of your
Yes.
brain that's rational, judgment, reasoning. It's not even formed until you're about 25, believe it or not. So asking a teenager to put their phone down to go to
Hmm.
sleep is like, there are some who can do it. Good for them, but it's rare. So those are the
It
limits that you
is.
have to put. Like, I still don't want them falling asleep with stuff, ideally, because they will delay sleep
Yes.
a lot.
It's true. And, going back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, I have a 6-year-old.
Mhm.
When she wakes up super early, which, she doesn't have any sleep issues really, which I'm very lucky
Yeah.
by that count. But one small issue is she'll wake up a little early. She'll wake up maybe too early, maybe 5:30, something like that. And I know, if I'm still sleeping, she's very smart for a 6-year-old.
Okay.
I'm sure they all are, but they figure out a way to get to the iPad.
Yeah.
And so she figures it out, and then she'll spend about half an hour sort of, I'm very strict with what's on the iPad, of course, but
Mhm.
she'll go watch her kid
Yeah.
stuff for about half an hour in the morning. And then she sort of will slowly wake me up.
Yeah.
But I have this feeling that if I hadn't sort of set limits with her early on with an
Yeah.
iPad and went through already all of those screaming matches of no, I'm taking it, can't have it anymore after a certain time.
Yeah.
I went through all that and it hurt at the time. It was hard for her at the time, but at this point, if it all wound up at this point where she can watch it for half an hour and then wake me up, that's great.
Yep. Yep.
But I hear from a lot of parents, who are still struggling with that, where if they set a certain limit, and I know this is far away from the topic of binge watching, but it is about screens and everything
Totally.
like that and addictions. And they really will get into, physical fights with their kids, whether they're 6 or 10 or whatever it is, screaming, crying when you
Mhm.
take away their screen.
Yeah.
And it's strange to use the word addiction with someone so young, but it
Right.
does seem pretty common
Oh,
these
yeah.
days.
I mean, it's the ability addiction. I mean, so many people are addicted to screens right now. It's like the ability
Yes.
to put it down without distress and not be one of the things that I think is really telling is to just look at your if you have an iPhone,
Yep.
to look at how many pickups you have, how often you actually touch your phone and pick it
Oh,
up.
pickups, because everyone looks at minutes, but I don't know that people know
How
to look for
often you
pickups.
touch your phone, right?
Oh,
It's
I think I'd be
shocking.
terrified to
It's
learn.
terrifying. So it's like if you feel distress, the urge, you can't, like, it makes you anxious to not have it, and
Mhm.
it's really the thing that you're relying on all the time, then that's a problem. And with kids, there's going to be who are used to using it, there's going to be outbursts. I mean, that's part
Yep.
of parenting, unfortunately, right? Like
Yes, it
setting a
is.
limit. If someone sets a limit for me and tells me I can never have an ice cream sundae again, I'm gonna have an outburst, right? So
Yeah.
there's things that are gonna be outbursts. And it's about
Mhm.
staying consistent. And if you stay
Mhm.
consistent for a few days, usually it will start to wind down after a while.
I hear you. It's the same probably with, the true crime binge watching and all of that. It's
Yeah.
like, if it's not turning in, as we said, if it's not turning into an addiction, if you can get through a night like I have,
Yeah.
without it, without having an outburst
Yeah.
yourself, and you can soothe yourself to sleep in some other way, I think it's probably all good to binge watch true crime, right?
All good. Yeah, there's a
Okay,
lot
good.
of, like we've said, the hard and fast rules, I think, it doesn't work for everyone. So
Yeah.
figure out what works for you. And the other thing too is like if you're worried that it is starting to impact negatively your end of night routine
Mm-hmm.
or being able to go to sleep routinely at a certain time. I don't expect perfection. Like I said, I'm stuck watching the Olympics a lot of times right now late. But if you really want to try and make that an actual goal for you, then work backwards. So set your goal bedtime, set an alarm on your phone to go off at a certain time, set reminders. I'm a huge fan of reminders. Some people can't stand them, but I will have an alarm go off on my phone like on every night at the same time saying, start getting ready for bed. And then just to remind me, because sometimes I get sucked into stuff. And I'll lose track of time. So things like that to work backwards, allow time to decompress. If you can't find time for a half-hour show or 10 minutes even here and there, half hour can be hard some nights. But if you can't find time routinely to have a little bit of time to decompress routinely, and if it's got to be with watching a show, fine. But you got to make the time for it and schedule it in. You need that schedule to help as your framework so that it then will help with the bedtime at night.
Yeah, and I mean, I think my last sort of, I don't know if it's a question so much as a curiosity is, you're talking about the Olympics as being something that you sort of is part of your nighttime routine. You're watching it. It's sort of joyful. It's exciting.
Yeah.
And, myself, many other people based on Reddit, love these scarier things, whether it's horror, whether it's Game of Thrones, whether it's true crime, anything like that. I think, and this is sort of saying the quiet part out loud, but is there I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong or, issue if that kind of content is the stuff that really soothes you. I mean, I know I'm not committing murder by day, even if I'm listening to it at night.
Right.
And I'm certainly not, like mock or sort of mimicking any of this behavior. I just find it entertaining.
Yeah.
And so I don't, I'm lucky I don't have like nightmares on a regular basis about the stuff that I'm watching. So speaking on behalf of this true crime obsessive community, there's nothing wrong with us, right?
We're don't think people. So at all. And the thing that I do, and like we'll say to people, if they're concerned if something might be an issue or not, then you know what? The behaviorist in me always comes out. Why not just do an experiment? So one week with your true crime, one week with maybe something a bit lighter. And then
comedy, like you said.
1 week with nothing within like 20 minutes of bed. Like you could do a few weeks, or I like to do like a good week experiment as opposed to like a few days because you'll get a better picture. You do a comedy and then maybe try like nothing for 20 minutes before and then listen to something. Like you can do different types of experiments. And if it doesn't make a difference, fine.
Then we're okay.
You're okay. It's really about how do you feel during the day. Right? If you feel fine, you have a dip here and there, like after lunch, then you're good to go. If you're not having any nightmares, you do you, as I said.
I feel healthy by this conversation.
There you go.
Mentally and sleep-wise. Thank you so much for all these answers.
Thank you for speaking on behalf of a population that I cannot. I relate, mighty. But not relate in many ways.
So nobody does.
No, but there, like I've said, I have so many patients that love to listen to this stuff in the time before bed, and I'm like, all right, let's just figure out. We'll do an experiment.
It is funny though, because I do remember being pregnant and I have a very close friend and she's very like woo-woo, spiritual, all that kind of stuff. And when I was pregnant, she was like, Molly, you cannot listen to true crime and murder while you're pregnant. Like, I don't care if that's what you do in your regular life, but you're pregnant now. Like, what if your child is listening and all that stuff? I mean, I am not a doctor, but I didn't take that too seriously. But I mean, you do hear things like that, like can it affect your mood? I haven't personally found that it can, but if it's just something that entertains you the same way that a Disney movie would entertain someone else, it's soothing either way.
Then you do it.
I don't think that I hurt my unborn child by listening to true crime, but I do still think of that and like, what if?
Oh, I mean, it would be a conversation to have with a OBGYN, but I suspect that they would say the same thing. It's fine. The sleep is
Yes.
important, right? That you were sleeping.
Yep.
And if that's something that you need to relax, then all for it. And then the mood thing, like I said, it would be a good experiment. If someone's concerned about their mood being impacted by it, then, or nightmares or whatever, do an experiment then maybe taking away all noise or binge watching or whatever before bed.
There's
So
always
Molly, as
music,
you know, oh, what was that?
There's always music too.
Music. Yeah. And
Yep.
then the last thing to consider too, is that sometimes the noise differentials, like within music, or if you're listening to something that gets louder at a commercial, things like that, you do want to think about whether that's causing any awakenings, because that can for some
Yes.
people. So that's one thing to consider. But if it's really not impacting you, I don't, whatever.
Use those timers.
As long, use it with your falling asleep, but then don't keep it on all night while you're asleep.
Yep.
So there you go. So Molly, as you know, we always like to end with something to sleep on. One last point you want to share with anyone looking to change their sleep habits. So when it comes to binge watching and sleep, do you have any final thought for the audience, given everything that we've discussed? Say something to sleep on.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, based on the huge audiences for these types of podcasts, for these types of shows that I'm talking about, and I mentioned Reddit sort of in a joke, but not really. I mean, Reddit's gotten a lot more sort of grown up over the past few years, and there are thousands and thousands of people who, post about things that they're watching, love to chat about it. And I know that I'm not alone in falling to sleep to some true crime stuff. So, whatever works, I think, is something that you have pointed out over this time that we've been chatting. And just to borrow from sort of the medical community, do no harm. So I think as long as you are doing what works for you, and then also doing no harm to yourself, most importantly, but to others, combining those two philosophies, I think, works when it comes to this topic.
Thank you so much for being here, Molly, and for sharing
Thank you.
your thoughts with our audience. This was really fun to talk about something like this that
absolutely.
I do not do myself. So I know a lot of people have questions about binging, whether it's podcasts or TV or anything, and sleep. And I just can't wait to share this episode. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Shelby.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening to Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby, a Sleepopolis original podcast. Remember, if you're tired of hitting snooze, hit subscribe or follow right now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And for even more sleep tips, visit sleepopolis.com and my Instagram page at SleepDocShelby. Today's episode was produced by Ready Freddy Media. Our Senior Director of Content is Alana Nunez. Our Head of Content is Molly Stout. And I'm Dr. Shelby Harris. Until next time, sleep well.